The morning the envelope arrived, Sophia was elbow-deep in flour. She had been up since 5, the way she always was, because the bakery 2 streets over needed its pastry order filled before 6, and she was the one who filled it. Her hands moved without thinking. They had learned this work the way hands learn anything, through repetition, through cold mornings, through the quiet kind of discipline that nobody sees and nobody claps for. The kitchen smelled like butter and warm sugar. Outside, the city was still gray and half asleep. She shaped the dough. She slid the trays into the oven. She wiped her hands on her apron, and only then noticed the envelope on the floor just inside the front door, where it had been slipped through the mail slot sometime in the night. She almost left it there. She had bills to watch for, and this did not look like a bill. It looked expensive. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind of paper that costs more than it needs to. Her name was written on the front in careful, practiced handwriting, the kind you learn in a school that charges for that sort of lesson. She picked it up. She set it on the kitchen counter and forgot about it for 20 minutes, because the oven timer went off and the pastries needed turning. When she came back to it, she stood for a moment with a dish towel in her hands and looked at the return address on the back. Hargrove House. She recognized the address. She had grown up there. Or rather, she had lived there for 6 years, which is not quite the same thing as growing up somewhere. You grow up in a place when it grows around you, when it shapes you, when it claims you. Hargrove House had never claimed her. It had only ever tolerated her. She opened the envelope. It was a wedding invitation. Her stepsister Marguerite was getting married in 11 weeks. The venue was a private estate in the countryside. Dress code. Formal. A card inside asked for an RSVP by the end of the month. And at the bottom, in handwriting slightly different from the envelope, looser, quicker, as if added last, were 4 small words. Do bring someone, darling. Sophia read those 4 words twice. Then she set the invitation on the counter beside the flour canister and went back to work. That was the thing about Sophia. She always went back to work. She was 28 years old. She had been working since she was 16, which was the year her mother married Gerald Hargrove and moved them both into a house, where Sophia was made to understand, without anyone ever saying so plainly, that she did not quite belong. Gerald was not cruel. He was simply elsewhere, occupied with business, occupied with Marguerite, occupied with the careful project of maintaining a family name that had more history than money. He was kind to Sophia, the way a person is kind to a neighbor's child, politely, briefly, without any real investment. Marguerite was another matter. Marguerite was 26 then, 2 years younger than Sophia, and she had lived her whole life in the understanding that the world was arranged in her favor. This was not entirely her fault. It was what she had been taught, by the house and the name and the way adults had always spoken to her, not down to her, the way they spoke to most children, but across, as if she were already a peer. She had grown up being told she was special. The trouble with that kind of upbringing is that it requires a contrast to feel true. Marguerite needed someone around her who was ordinary, someone who served as proof. Sophia arrived at 13, quiet and thin, with a mother who cried in private and a suitcase that wasn't full enough. She was enrolled in the local school, not the good one Marguerite attended. She was given the back bedroom, the one that faced the wall of the neighbor's house. She was never told she was unwelcome. She was simply shown it, in the way spaces are arranged, in the way conversations shifted when she walked into rooms, in the careful and consistent way she was left out of small things, the Friday dinners, the weekend trips, the casual mentions of plans that did not include her name. She noticed all of it. She said nothing about any of it. That was the armor she had built before she even arrived at Hargrove House. Silence. Not cold silence, not bitter silence, but the kind that a person develops when they learn early that protest costs more than it earns. Her father had left when she was 4. She barely remembered him. Her mother worked 2 jobs for a decade and came home tired, in the particular way that means love expressed itself as a packed lunch and clean school clothes, and not much else. Sophia had learned to be self-sufficient, the way a plant grows toward the window. Not dramatically, just steadily, toward whatever light was available. At Hargrove House, the available light was limited. Marguerite tolerated her in the way a cat tolerates a new piece of furniture. There was no open hostility, at least not at first. There were simply the small exercises of power that teenage girls sometimes deploy with surgical precision, the comment about Sophia's haircut, delivered in front of friends, the invitation to a party that turned out not to exist, the casual mention at dinner of how nice it must be for Sophia to finally have a proper home, said in a tone that somehow made proper home sound like charity ward. Sophia's mother noticed but said nothing because her position in the house depended on not noticing. Gerald noticed nothing at all, and so Marguerite continued, and Sophia continued to say nothing, and the years stacked up the way years do. What changed things, eventually, was not a confrontation. It was a test. Sophia was 16 when she sat, without anyone telling her to, for a scholarship examination at a culinary school 2 towns over. She had read about it in a leaflet she found tucked under the counter at the bakery, where she spent her Saturdays washing dishes for £4 an hour. The examination was on a Sunday. She told no one she was going. She took 2 buses, sat in a room with 30 other students, and worked through a practical assessment and a written component in complete silence and complete focus. She passed. Not just passed. She came first. The letter arrived at Hargrove House because that was the address she had put on the form. It came on a Tuesday, addressed to her, and she collected it from the front step before anyone else was awake. She read it in the back bedroom with the door closed. Then she sat on the edge of her bed for a while and looked at the wall of the neighbor's house through the small window, and for the first time in years, she felt something that was not armor. She felt something that was closer to direction. She did not tell anyone at Hargrove House about the scholarship. Not that day, not for 2 weeks. And when she finally mentioned it at dinner, because the school needed a deposit paid, and she needed her mother to sign a form, she did it quietly, between the soup course and the main, as if she were mentioning a change in the bus schedule. Her mother's face did something complicated that was probably pride, badly hidden behind a lifetime of being careful. Gerald said, "Good for you," and meant it in the way people mean things when they are surprised. Marguerite said nothing for the rest of the dinner, and when she excused herself early, Sophia did not watch her go. She simply passed the salt to Gerald and asked him about his work, which was the kind of social grace that had come to her through observation, through years of watching how rooms operated and how people moved through them. She left Hargrove House 8 months later. She did not leave dramatically. She did not have a fight with Marguerite or announce herself at the door with a bag over her shoulder and a speech prepared. She simply packed her things over a weekend, said goodbye to her mother privately in the kitchen, with both of them holding mugs of tea, and neither of them quite managing to say the real things. And then she got into a taxi that took her to the train station, and the train took her to a new city, and the new city took her into itself, the way cities do when you arrive in them with nothing but clarity of purpose. She was 16 years old, and she knew what she wanted to do with her hands. The culinary school was stricter than she had imagined, and better than she had hoped. The head instructor was a woman called Mrs. Hartley, small, precise, with forearms like a baker and eyes that saw everything, and she recognized in Sophia something she recognized in very few students, which was the ability to absorb criticism without taking it personally. Some cried, a few got defensive, and spent more energy protecting their feelings than improving their work. Sophia simply listened, adjusted, tried again. She did not treat failure as an event. She treated it as information. She graduated at the top of her cohort. She worked the next year in a small hotel restaurant in the city, the kind of place that is not glamorous but is serious about its food. She learned timing there, how to run a section of a kitchen without raising her voice, how to hold quality when everything was happening at once, how to be calm in conditions that made other people frantic. The head chef was a quiet man named George who had spent 20 years working his way up from the bottom and had very little patience for people who expected shortcuts. He and Sophia understood each other without many words. She saved money. She applied for a placement in Lyon. She got it. She told no one back at Hargrove House because she no longer thought of Hargrove House as somewhere that required notification. She had been gone 2 years by then. She called her mother on Sundays. She sent a card at Christmas. She heard, through her mother's careful, edited accounts, that Marguerite was doing well, that Marguerite had a new boyfriend, that Marguerite had been photographed at a charity event, that Marguerite had started working with a fashion agency and was building something of a profile for herself. Sophia listened to these updates the way you listen to news about a country you once visited. She wished it no harm. She simply no longer lived there. Lyon was where things began to change, in a way that was harder to see while it was happening, and clearer only in retrospect. She worked under a chef named Pierre, who was neither kind nor unkind, but was brilliant, in the way that some people are brilliant. Unpredictably, explosively, with long stretches of ordinary, followed by moments that made everyone in the kitchen stop and pay attention. She learned to study those moments. She learned to take apart a plate of food the way a watchmaker takes apart a mechanism, looking for the logic inside the beauty. She also learned, in Lyon, that she was good with people, in a way she had not previously recognized as a skill. Not just good at cooking for them, but good at understanding what they wanted before they said it, good at reading the difference between what a person ordered and what they actually needed, good at making people feel that the room they had walked into had been waiting for them specifically. This was partly intuition, and partly the years of quiet observation she had done at Hargrove House, watching how social rooms operated, learning to read the temperature of a space by the way people held their shoulders. She was 23 when a woman named Claire, who worked in hotel development and had eaten at the restaurant 3 times in a month, sat down at the bar near the end of service and asked Sophia what she wanted to do next. Sophia told her. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Claire had a project. A boutique hotel group expanding into Eastern Europe, looking for someone who could develop its food program from the ground up. It was not a small thing. It required moving. It required building a team, building relationships with local suppliers, building a menu philosophy that could work across 4 properties, with different characters but one consistent identity. It required someone who was not afraid of starting with nothing. Sophia said yes before Claire finished the sentence. She moved. She built. She spent the next 3 years doing the kind of work that does not look impressive from the outside, because it is too specific to explain briefly. The negotiations with a Croatian fisherman about morning delivery windows. The months spent developing a pastry program with a local woman in Bratislava, who had been baking in the same way for 40 years, and needed convincing that new did not mean better. The complete rebuild of a kitchen in Budapest that had been designed by someone who had never stood in a kitchen for longer than 15 minutes. She did not document any of it on social media. She did not send newsletters. She did not appear in profiles or give quotes to magazines. She simply did the work and trusted that the work would speak when speaking was required. She was 27 when she got the promotion. That meant her name was now attached to the hotel group's food identity across all 6 of its properties. She was 28 when the envelope arrived through her mail slot at 5 in the morning, while she was making pastries for the bakery 2 streets over, because she had kept the habit of early mornings, not because she had to, but because she trusted her hands most at that hour. She set the invitation on the counter and went back to work. She thought about it while the oven ran its second cycle. She thought about it while she packaged the pastries into their boxes and stacked them by the door for collection. She thought about it while she washed the trays and dried them and hung her apron on the hook by the window. She was not angry. That surprised her a little. She had expected anger, and found instead a kind of cool, quiet interest. The invitation was a thing Marguerite had sent thinking it was a blade. Sophia stood in her kitchen and thought about that for a moment, and then thought about something else. About a man she knew. A friend, who was also something more than a friend, but they had not quite named it yet. A quiet, tall man called Owen, who designed buildings for a living, and made her laugh, without appearing to try. She had been meaning to find a reason to introduce him to some of her world. Here, apparently, was a reason. She dried her hands. She found a sheet of paper. She wrote her reply in 4 lines, sealed it, and set it by the door to post on her way out. She accepted the invitation. She chose the dress 2 days later, not because she had been planning to make a statement, but because a friend who ran a small atelier in Paris had been asking for months to see her in something she had made for the season. And the timing was, in the end, simply good. Marguerite Hargrove had been planning this wedding for 14 months. She had a binder for it, not 1 binder, 3. They lived on the corner of her dressing table in a city apartment that cost more per month than Sophia spent on food in a year, organized by category, labeled in her own handwriting, with the neat, controlled script she had practiced at the expensive school, where handwriting was still considered a mark of character. The binders held floor plan diagrams, fabric swatches, color gradients cut from magazines, printed email chains with vendors, printed email chains with caterers, printed email chains with the florist, whom she had dismissed, and rehired twice, and was on the verge of dismissing again. She was not a difficult person, she told herself. She simply had a clear vision. The vision had been forming for longer than 14 months, if she was honest, though she was rarely fully honest in the direction of her own interior. She had been forming this vision since she was a child and first understood that weddings were the event through which a woman's entire social value was confirmed or denied in a single afternoon. That was not something she had been told in those words. It was something she had absorbed from 1,000 smaller signals, from the way her father's face changed at the mention of a good family, from the way the women in her mother's social circle talked about other women's marriages with the same careful attention a financial analyst gives to investment returns, from the way the phrase "well married" had always sounded, in those rooms, less like a description and more like an achievement. She had been working toward this, in the specific way she worked toward things, for years. Count Nikolai Ashford was not precisely a count in any modern legal sense. The title had passed down through his father's family, from a line that predated the restructuring of the peerage by several generations, and it now meant very little in official terms, but quite a lot in the terms that mattered to Marguerite, the terms of dinner parties, of introductions at charity events, of the particular tone that came into people's voices when they heard his name and understood the length of it. Nikolai himself was 34, dark-haired, pleasant company, and not unintelligent, though his intelligence ran more toward comfort than ambition. He liked his estate. He liked his dogs. He liked the idea of a wife who would manage the social dimension of his life without requiring him to think too hard about it. He had found, in Marguerite, someone who would manage that dimension and several others without requiring him to ask. They had met at a charity dinner 2 years ago. She had been seated next to him by accident, or so she told people, though the seating had in fact been arranged by a mutual acquaintance who had been given a very specific set of preferences in advance. Marguerite had prepared for the evening the way she prepared for everything important, thoroughly, without apparent effort, so that when she sat down beside him and began talking about the restoration of old houses, which happened to be his primary passion, it seemed like coincidence, rather than the result of 3 days of careful research. He had asked for her number before dessert arrived. She had given it to him with the confidence of someone who had never genuinely doubted an outcome she had set her mind to. They dated for a year. He proposed in a rose garden at his family estate on a Tuesday afternoon that had been arranged by Marguerite's closest friend to appear spontaneous, while in fact being entirely choreographed, including the photographer, hidden in the hedgerow, who captured the moment for the engagement announcement that ran in 3 publications the following week. Marguerite was, by any reasonable measure, someone who knew what she wanted and worked hard to get it. The trouble was that the version of herself she was building required constant maintenance. It required that the story be controlled. Who saw her, who spoke about her, who appeared in her social photographs and who did not. She had curated her life the way a gallery curator manages a collection, ensuring that nothing hung beside something that diminished it, that every element reinforced the overall impression she was trying to create. This was why Sophia's existence had always been an irritant. Not a threat, Marguerite told herself. Never a threat. Sophia was nobody. Sophia had left at 16 with a scholarship to a cooking school, and had spent the following decade doing whatever it was that people did when they had no real social standing to protect. Moving around, working in kitchens, disappearing into the kind of life that left no trace in the publications Marguerite read. She had heard, through her stepmother Elena, that Sophia was living abroad now. That was the extent of what she knew and the extent of what she cared to know. Sophia was a footnote, the quiet, forgettable stepsister from her father's second marriage who had never quite fit and eventually stopped trying. The decision to invite her had not come from generosity. It had come from Marguerite's closest friend, a woman called Diana, who had been handling Marguerite's social image since university and had the kind of brain that was always thinking 2 moves ahead. Diana had been the one to suggest it, over coffee in Marguerite's apartment, while the third binder was spread open on the dining table between them. "Invite her," Diana said. Marguerite looked up. "To the wedding?" "Think about it," Diana said. "You invite her, and she shows up in something terrible because she has no money and no idea, and everyone sees you being magnanimous and generous to your poor little stepsister, and everyone also sees the contrast." She thought for a moment. You were going to do a toast anyway. It practically writes itself. Marguerite turned this over in her mind. She did not consider herself the kind of person who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. She considered herself a strategist, and what Diana was describing was, in its architecture, a strategy. The invitation would make Marguerite look inclusive, warm, family-oriented, qualities the Ashford family placed considerable stock in, particularly Nikolai's mother, Lady Helena, who had made 3 separate comments in the past year about the importance of family bonds. It would also, in the execution, provide a moment of visible contrast that confirmed everything Marguerite had always known about the difference between herself and Sophia. She wrote the invitation that evening. She added the 4 words at the bottom herself, with the looser handwriting. Do bring someone, darling. Because Diana had suggested it, and because it completed the picture. Sophia, showing up with whoever she had managed to find, in whatever she had managed to afford, with no idea what she had walked into. The image was almost too easy. She did not think about Sophia again for 3 days. The wedding preparations consumed her. There was the florist situation, which had escalated again because of a disagreement about the height of the table centerpieces, and a long phone call with the caterer about the canapé selection for the pre-ceremony drinks, and a difficult conversation with her dress designer about the adjustment to the neckline, and a dinner with Nikolai's parents at their London house, where Lady Helena had spoken at some length about the importance of children in a marriage, and the importance of a wife who understood that an estate required tending the way a garden required tending, by which she meant several things she did not say directly. Marguerite smiled through all of it. She was good at that, at keeping the surface of her face exactly as she needed it, while the interior ran its own calculations. She was less good, she would not have admitted, at sitting with uncertainty. The uncertainty arrived 10 days after she had sent the invitation, in the form of Sophia's reply. It came by actual post, which was itself mildly surprising. A small card, cream-colored, which made Marguerite notice with some irritation that Sophia had matched the paper quality, without apparently trying. The reply said, in neat, small handwriting, "Thank you, Marguerite. I'll be there. Please expect 2." That was all. No enthusiasm, no exclamation, no mention of being honored or pleased. Just a clear, calm acceptance, as if the wedding were an appointment she was penciling into a schedule that was already full. Marguerite read it twice, and then set it down on her dressing table. It annoyed her in a way she could not entirely account for, and would not have examined even if she could. She folded it back into its envelope and moved it to the edge of the table with the tip of one finger, then opened her first binder and returned to the seating chart, which needed revision, because Nikolai's cousin had confirmed attendance after all, and needed to be placed somewhere that accounted for the known tensions between him and his father's side of the family. There was always something to arrange, that was the comfort of it. Meanwhile, the town where Sophia now lived was 600 miles away, and Sophia was having a conversation with Owen that had started, as their conversations often did, over very ordinary logistics. Owen came on Thursdays for dinner. This was not something they had agreed to formally. It was something that had happened gradually over the course of 5 months, first once as an invitation, then again by habit, then as a quiet assumption they both held without discussing. He would bring bread, or wine, or both. She would cook. They would sit at her small table by the window and talk for a long time, and then he would go home. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, the least complicated thing in Sophia's life, which she found both unexpected and valuable. Owen was 31. He had grown up in a small town in the north of England, the son of a schoolteacher and a man who fixed boats for a living, and he had studied architecture on a scholarship and then worked for a decade in a firm in Manchester before starting his own small practice that focused on the renovation of old buildings. He was not flashy. He did not own many things, and did not appear to want to. He had a quality that Sophia had taken time to name, and eventually identified as groundedness, the quality of being exactly where he was, not perpetually auditioning for some better version of his life. She told him about the wedding on a Thursday. She set the invitation on the table between the breadboard and the wine bottle, and told him the general shape of things, the stepsister, the house, the years of careful exclusion, the 4 words at the bottom of the card. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued about him most. When she finished, he poured more wine for both of them and said, "Are you going?" "I'm going," she said. He nodded. Do you want company? She looked at him. Yes, she said. I was going to ask. He looked at the invitation. Dress code formal. I know, she said. Do you own anything formal? I own a suit, he said. It's from my cousin's wedding 3 years ago. It still fits. Sophia thought about this. She thought about the estate in the countryside, the guests who would arrive with titles, and with the particular social confidence of people who had never been made to feel they did not belong. She thought about Marguerite's face in the moment she looked across a room and found Sophia on the wrong side of her calculations. Wear the suit, Sophia said. It'll be fine. The week before the wedding, a package arrived from Paris. It was wrapped in tissue paper and a soft gray box, and inside was the dress her friend Camille had been promising to send. A long column of deep green silk that Camille had made for the season's collection and wanted on a real person in a real setting. There was a note tucked in the tissue paper that said, "You'll do it justice. Wear it somewhere that matters." Sophia hung it on the back of her wardrobe door and looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen, where a recipe she was developing needed another hour of her attention, and gave it the hour without distraction, because that was how she had always operated, one thing at a time, each thing given what it needed, nothing left half done. The dress caught the light when she turned to close the kitchen door. She did not look at it again until the morning they left. 11 weeks had passed since the envelope arrived through her mail slot. 11 weeks, during which Marguerite had thought about the wedding every single day, and about Sophia, almost not at all, having filed her away as a minor piece of a larger arrangement. 11 weeks during which Sophia had done her work, developed her recipes, had her Thursday dinners, told her mother on a Sunday phone call that yes, she was going, and not elaborated when her mother said, quietly, "Be careful, love." Sophia had said, "I'll be fine, Mum," and she had meant it not as reassurance but as a statement of fact, the way she meant most things, plainly, accurately, without excess. She was always fine. She had been making herself fine since she was 13 years old, with a suitcase that wasn't full enough, learning to be fine the way you learn any skill, through practice, through the accumulation of small disciplines, through the decision made quietly and repeatedly, that you are not going to let the shape of other people's expectations define the shape of your own life. She was fine. The car to the station left at 7 in the morning, and she was ready at 6:45, the green dress carefully folded in a garment bag. Owen in his suit, already waiting at the bottom of the stairs, his hair slightly neater than usual, a coffee in each hand. He held one out to her. She took it. They went. The estate was called Fenmore Park, and it announced itself from the road. It did not announce itself modestly. The gate was iron, tall, and flanked by stone pillars, topped with carved figures, that had been weathered into something vaguely bird-like by 200 years of English rain. The driveway ran for nearly half a mile through grounds that were kept in the careful, expensive way that suggested constant labor made invisible. There were oak trees on either side, old enough that their canopies had grown to touch in places, making an arch that dappled the morning light into something almost theatrical. Sophia looked at it through the car window. Not the gate, not the oaks. She looked at the light. Owen was quiet beside her. He had the particular quality of silence that belongs to people who are comfortable and not performing comfort. He was simply there, watching the driveway pass, one hand resting on the seat between them. He had not said anything about the estate being impressive. She appreciated that. The cars ahead of them stopped in a slow queue near the front entrance, where 2 young men in dark suits were directing guests toward a gravel courtyard to the left of the main house. Photographers stood near the entrance, a professional one, hired, and 2 or 3 guests who had produced their own cameras already. Though the ceremony was still 90 minutes away, the morning light was good, and everyone seemed to be aware of it. Sophia stepped out of the car. The garment bag was in her left hand. She had done her hair simply, back, pinned, with the minimum of things that looked like effort while being the result of considerable practice. She wore no jewelry except for a single pair of small gold earrings that had been her mother's. She was not thinking about how she appeared. She was thinking about the gravel underfoot, about the sound of voices somewhere to the right, about the particular way the front facade of the house caught the morning sun and made the stone look almost golden. Owen came around to stand beside her. Around them, other guests were arriving. Women in hats, in fitted jackets, in silk dresses in the colors that English garden parties favor. Pale blue, cream, mint, rose. Men in morning suits, in linen jackets, in the slightly strained expressions of men who have dressed more formally than they are comfortable with. Children in miniature formal clothes. An older woman, being helped out of a car by a younger man, who seemed to be her grandson. Two women who arrived together and greeted each other with the warmth of people who had not seen each other in years and had a great deal to say. It was, in the ordinary way of weddings, a gathering of people who had been connected to each other by one or two people at the center. Most of them did not know most of the others. They were linked by Marguerite, or by Nikolai, and those two circles had different textures to them. Marguerite's side was tighter, more stylized, more aware of the performance. Nikolai's side was looser, older, more rooted in the rhythms of the country rather than the city. Sophia walked toward the registration table near the main entrance. A young woman with a clipboard found her name and handed her a small envelope containing a table card. Table 7, she noted. Not the back, but not the front. The middle, the deliberate middle, where she would be visible but not prominent. She recognized the placement as intentional, without being able to prove it. She put the card in her small bag and moved on. Inside the main hall, waiting guests were being directed to a room off the left corridor, where champagne was being offered before the ceremony. The hall itself was extraordinary. Stone floors, a ceiling painted in faded pastoral colors, two fireplaces large enough to stand in, portraits of people who had lived and died in this house over centuries. Sophia moved through it without stopping. She did stop in the corridor. There was a painting she noticed, not a portrait, a landscape, painted in the loose, confident style of someone who had spent time outdoors looking before touching the brush to canvas. It showed a hillside at what appeared to be early evening, the light going orange at the horizon and blue at the top, and in the middle distance, a farmhouse with a single lit window. It was not a famous painting. It was not even, probably, a particularly valuable one. But it was real. It had been made by someone who had stood somewhere and paid attention. She looked at it for a long moment. Owen appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the painting without being asked to. "That's the Ashford Valley," he said quietly. "You can tell from the ridgeline. I drove through it on the way." Sophia looked at him. "I do renovations," he said. "I look at ridgelines." She smiled. They went into the champagne room. The champagne room, she did not know its official name, but that was clearly its function this morning, was already a quarter full. Guests stood in small clusters, finding their social footing. A string quartet was playing something quiet in one corner. Tall windows looked out onto the side garden, where more groundskeeping than a small army could account for had produced grass the color of a snooker table, and flower beds so orderly they looked architectural. Sophia took a glass from a passing tray. She was aware, with the low-frequency awareness of someone who had grown up having to track rooms, that certain people were registering her arrival, not loudly, not with any visible reaction. It was the small shift of eyes that happens when someone unexpected enters a space. Unexpected not because they were uninvited, but because they did not match the internal forecast. She was taller than she used to be, or carried herself as though she were. The green dress moved with her. Her hair was simple in the way that takes skill. Owen beside her was quietly, solidly present, in a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who have the right build for them, and don't need anything more. She noticed the shift. She did not react to it. What she did instead was the thing she had learned to do over years of moving through professional rooms, where she was often the youngest person, the only woman in a kitchen, the outsider, who needed to establish credibility without appearing to try too hard. She made herself available to the room without demanding anything from it. She did not seek eyes. She did not avoid them. She stood. She held her glass. She answered when spoken to and initiated when it felt natural. And she waited for the room to settle around her the way rooms do when they have finished their first assessment. It settled faster than she expected. This was because of a woman named Harriet, who was 60-something, silver-haired, and wearing a jacket the color of old moss, and who came across the room directly towards Sophia, with the straightforward confidence of someone who had not spent any of her adult life worrying about what her approach looked like. Harriet said, "You're not from Nikolai's side, are you?" It was not quite a question. Sophia said, No, I'm Marguerite's stepsister, Harriet said. Ah. She looked at Sophia for a moment, with the kind of look that is actually an assessment, not a social formality. She said, "Are you in the food business? I ask because you're looking at the canapes the way I look at my horses." Sophia looked at the canapé in her hand, which she had not consciously been studying, but which she now realized she had in fact been mentally deconstructing. She said, "Yes. I run the food program for a hotel group." Harriet said, "Which group?" Sophia told her. Harriet's expression shifted, in the way expressions do when a name lands and connects. She said, "I know that group. I stayed at the property in Budapest last spring. The food was extraordinary." "That was ours," Sophia said. Harriet said, "Yours?" "I developed the program," Sophia said, "with a team. The pastry chef there is a woman named Marta, who has been baking since before I was born. Most of what you ate was hers." Harriet looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "I have a foundation. We fund cultural and hospitality projects in the region. I've been looking for someone who knows the Eastern European market from the inside." She paused. "Is your evening full?" Sophia thought about Table 7. She thought about Marguerite's script and where this conversation sat in relation to it. "No," she said. "Good," Harriet said. "Find me after the ceremony." She moved away with the easy authority of someone whose time was valuable and who did not perform the fact. Sophia watched her go, and then looked at Owen, who had been standing slightly to her right during the entire exchange, and had not said a word, and had not needed to. He raised an eyebrow. Sophia raised hers in return, and took a small, calm sip of champagne. In another wing of the house, Marguerite was sitting at a dressing table, while a woman applied something to her cheekbones with a very small brush. There were 4 other people in the room. Diana, a bridesmaid named Claire, the dress designer's assistant who had come in person to manage the final fitting, and a woman called Hannah who had been hired to manage the day's logistics, and who was currently speaking quietly into a phone headset about a timing issue with the ceremony flowers. Marguerite was not looking at herself in the mirror. She was looking at the window, which showed a rectangle of blue sky and the tops of the oak trees at the end of the drive. She was thinking about the seating chart, because there had been a late change, and she was not certain the revision had been communicated to the venue coordinator. She was thinking about the toast, which she had memorized, but not yet felt fully comfortable with, particularly the middle section, where she mentioned her father and his second marriage. She was thinking about the centerpiece on Table 4, which had looked slightly lower than the others when she had reviewed the setup at 7 in the morning, and whether that was within the range of acceptable variation, or whether she needed to say something. She was not thinking about Sophia. This was, she would later understand, a significant error. The error was not in the invitation itself. The error was in the assumption underneath it, the assumption that she knew who Sophia was, that Sophia had remained fixed in the position Marguerite had always assigned to her, like a piece of furniture that stays in the corner, because it has never been moved. The trouble with furniture is that it is possible to redecorate while you are not paying attention. Marguerite's mother, her own mother, not Elena, who had been Gerald's second wife, had said something once, when Marguerite was a teenager, that she had filed away and never quite discarded. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing to prove. She had not thought about Sophia when her mother said it. She thought about it now, briefly, without being able to say why, and then the woman with the small brush asked her to look up, and she looked up, and the thought dissolved into the more immediate business of getting married. The ceremony was set to begin at noon. At 11:45, Sophia and Owen took their seats in the 3rd row on the right side of the aisle, because that was where Table 7's guests were directed, and because the usher who walked them there was a young man so nervous about performing his function correctly that Sophia thanked him with a warmth that made him stand slightly straighter as he turned away. She sat. She looked at the front of the room, at the flowers banked along the sides of the aisle, at the registrar standing at the front, with the contained composure of someone who has done this 300 times and still treats it as if it matters, at the stained glass above the doorway through which the wedding party would enter, at the light that came through that glass and fell in colored shapes on the stone floor. Nikolai came in from the side and stood at the front. He was a pleasant-looking man, not remarkable, with the relaxed posture of someone who had grown up comfortable in his own body, and had never had much reason to question that comfort. He looked at the room without appearing nervous. He looked the way people look when a thing they have decided is finally arriving, and they simply need to receive it. Beside Sophia, Owen sat with his legs crossed at the knee, and looked at the architecture. He noticed things. She had learned this about him, that he looked at ceilings and corners and the way weight was distributed through old stone, and that this was not absence but a form of attention that simply ran on a different track than social attention. She put her hand briefly on his arm. He looked at her. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The string quartet shifted into a new key. The doors at the back of the room opened, and Marguerite walked in. She was, in the way that brides often are on the day, extraordinary. The dress was something that had clearly cost considerably more than it looked, and that was the point. It did not call attention to itself. It simply made her look like the best version of herself, which is the highest achievement any garment can manage. Her face was composed, her posture exact, her expression calibrated to the precise degree of emotion that is appropriate for a public ceremony. Present, moved, but not overwhelmed. She walked down the aisle. She did not look at table 7. She was looking at Nikolai, which was correct, which was where her eyes should be, and where her story needed her eyes to be. And so she did not see Sophia until she had reached the front and taken her position beside Nikolai, and the registrar began to speak. And then, in the settling of the room, in the moment when everyone exhales and adjusts and finally sits properly, her gaze moved along the front rows without meaning to, the way eyes move when they are searching for familiar faces. And it found table 7. It found Sophia. Marguerite's gaze lasted 3 seconds. Then she returned her eyes to the registrar. But something in the careful architecture of her mourning had shifted, in the way a very precise structure shifts when one of its load-bearing assumptions turns out to have been slightly wrong. She could not have said what, exactly. She could only have said that the version of this day she had been carrying in her mind for 14 months looked, in this moment, very slightly different from the one she was actually in. The registrar spoke. Nikolai answered. Marguerite answered. The room was quiet and warm, and the colored light from the stained glass moved slowly across the stone floor, as the sun moved overhead, indifferent to everyone's plans, doing only what it always did. The ceremony continued. Nobody who had not been inside one of the hotel group's properties would have known what it meant. That was the point. That had always been the point of the way Sophia worked. Not invisibility exactly, but a preference for substance over signal, for the thing being good over the thing being seen to be good. She had never posted photographs of her kitchens. She had never given quotable interviews. She had attended one industry conference in 3 years, and spent most of it in the kitchen that was catering the event, talking to the prep cook about his knife technique, because that conversation was more useful than anything happening in the panel rooms. The hotel group's name, when she said it to Harriet in the champagne room, had landed the way things land when they are real, not with noise, but with the small, solid contact of something recognized. This was because of 3 years of work that had looked, from the outside, like nothing much. It had started in Zagreb, in a building that smelled of damp plaster and the particular combination of cooking fat and coffee that belongs to Eastern European hotel restaurants that have been running on the same menu since 1987. Sophia had arrived with a single bag and a brief from Claire, the woman who had offered her the position in Lyon, that said, in essence, "We need the food to be a reason to come, not an afterthought." The Zagreb property had a kitchen that had been designed by someone who prioritized equipment over flow. Everything was the right tool and in the wrong place. The extraction was inadequate. The storage was split across 2 rooms that were not adjacent. The prep area was too small for the morning service that the restaurant did for hotel guests, which meant the prep happened the night before, which meant the food was less fresh than it needed to be, which meant the guests ate food that was technically correct and experientially forgettable. Sophia spent her first 2 weeks not cooking. She spent them watching. She watched the kitchen team, 3 full-time cooks and a rotating roster of part-time staff who had all been there longer than they should have, in a kitchen that had never given them reason to care. She watched their patterns, their shortcuts, the small workarounds they had developed to manage the inadequate space. She watched which problems they had given up solving, because no one had ever supported them in solving. On the 15th day, she cooked. She made 1 dish, a simple lunch, nothing more. She used the local market, which she had visited every morning that first 2 weeks, and a technique she had brought from Lyon, and a piece of understanding she had carried from every kitchen she had worked in, which was that food tastes of where it comes from, and also of how it has been handled, and that both of those things are within your control if you are willing to pay attention. The kitchen team ate the lunch at the end of service. Nobody said anything. On the 16th day, the head cook, a man named Tomislav, who had worked in that kitchen for 9 years with the expression of someone who had accepted permanent disappointment, came to her before the morning service and asked if he could show her something. He showed her a dish he had been developing in his own time, at home, that he had never put on the menu because the previous manager had not encouraged initiative, and he had eventually stopped offering it. She tasted it. She asked him 3 questions. She told him it needed one change, and that if he made that change it would go on the next week's menu. He made the change. It went on the menu. A food critic who happened to be staying at the hotel that month ate it. She wrote about it in a small but well-read publication that covered Central European food culture. The paragraph was 7 sentences long. Within 3 months, the restaurant had a waiting list for dinner on weekends. Sophia was not in the paragraph. Tomislav was. She moved on to Bratislava. Bratislava had a different problem, which was that the hotel's food program was perfectly decent and completely without identity. It could have been anywhere. It was the culinary equivalent of a gray carpet, not offensive, not remarkable, not anything. The guests ate there because they were already in the hotel, and the alternative was going out in the rain. The city, however, had an extraordinary food history that was being largely ignored by the restaurant. Sophia spent her first week not in the hotel kitchen, but in the city's markets, and in the homes of 3 people she had been connected to through a network of introductions that had started with Tomislav's cousin and passed through 2 other conversations before arriving at a woman named Marta. Marta was 61 years old. She had been baking in the same kitchen, her family's kitchen, in an apartment block 15 minutes from the city center. For 40 years, she baked the way certain people work at things, not as a career decision, but as the expression of an understanding they were born with. The way a person is born knowing how to read a room, or how to tell when a story is true. She had no formal training. She had recipes that went back 3 generations, written on cards in handwriting so old the ink had gone brown, and she had intuitions about fermentation and temperature and time that no card could hold. Sophia asked if she could learn from her. Marta said, "You are a professional chef." Sophia said, "I am, and I can make a pastry that is technically correct, but yours is alive and mine isn't. I want to understand why." Marta looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Tuesday morning, 6 o'clock. Sophia was there at 5:45. She spent 6 weeks going to Marta's kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before the hotel service. She took notes not in words but in observations. The way Marta's hands felt the dough before she decided whether it needed more time. The way she listened to the sound of the oven with the particular focus of someone who had learned to read the heat through sound rather than a thermometer. The way she used the fat from a very specific local supplier, because the ratio of something in it was different, and that difference mattered, in a way that couldn't be fully explained, but was fully real. Sophia built the Bratislava menu around those Tuesdays and Thursdays, not replicating Marta's recipes. That would have been both impossible and wrong. Building something that understood what Marta understood about the relationship between this specific place and what could be made in it. The hotel's food program changed. Guests started talking about it. A chef from Vienna made a special trip to eat the bread. Sophia moved on to Budapest. Budapest had the most complicated problem of the 3. A kitchen that had been rebuilt by a designer with a strong visual sensibility and a limited understanding of how kitchens actually function. It was beautiful to look at and nearly impossible to work in. The flow was wrong. The ventilation, which had been designed around the aesthetic of the space, was inadequate for the heat generated by a full dinner service. The storage was beautiful and impractical. The entire kitchen produced a very specific kind of suffering that the team had been enduring in silence, because the management had been so proud of the renovation they had commissioned that any criticism of it had felt disloyal. Sophia wrote a report. It was 12 pages. It named every problem and every fix required, with costs and time frames. It was not diplomatic. It was not delivered warmly. It was correct. Claire read it and sat with it for a week. Then she approved the renovation. The Budapest kitchen closed for 6 weeks. Sophia managed the service from a temporary setup. When the kitchen reopened, it worked. Not as beautifully as before, from a visual standpoint, because function had overridden form in 3 key areas. But it worked, which meant the team could work, which meant the food could be what it was capable of being. 3 months after the reopening, a major travel publication listed the Budapest property as one of its recommended hotels of the year. The food was mentioned specifically. The kitchen team was mentioned by name. Sophia was not. That was not modesty. It was accuracy. The food was theirs. She had created the conditions. The food itself was theirs. This was the body of work that had accumulated, quietly, in the years since she had left Hargrove House on a morning with a suitcase and a train ticket. It was not the work of someone who had been struggling. It was the work of someone who had been building, deliberately, methodically, with the specific kind of patience that only belongs to people who are not waiting to be seen. None of this was known to Marguerite. None of it was known to Gerald, who still ran his business and thought of Sophia, on the occasions he thought of her at all, as the quiet girl who had done something with catering. None of it was known to Diana, who had been the architect of the invitation strategy. None of it was known to the guests at Fenmore Park who had given Sophia that first impression assessment when she walked into the champagne room and found it less decisive than they expected. Harriet knew now. She had confirmed what she already half knew, which was that the Budapest property's extraordinary lunch had come from a program that had been built by someone she was now standing 3 feet away from, in a room full of champagne and morning light. Harriet was the chairperson of the Cultural Foundation that had been looking, for 18 months, for a partner in the Eastern European hospitality space, someone who understood the region from the inside, who had relationships with local producers, who had demonstrated the ability to connect international standards with deeply rooted local identity. She had been through 4 candidates who had looked right on paper and been wrong in conversation. The 5th was currently standing in front of her in a green silk dress at her nephew's wedding, having been invited here as someone's joke. She found this privately amusing. After the ceremony, she found Sophia again. They sat in 2 chairs near the edge of the garden terrace, apart from the main crowd, close enough to be visible, removed enough to talk properly. Owen had gone to get them both something to drink and had read the situation with the accuracy that was one of the things Sophia valued most about him, and he came back, set the glasses down, and went to look at the stonework of the east wall without being asked. Harriet talked for 20 minutes about the foundation's work and what it was trying to do in the region. She talked about what had been tried and why it had not been quite right, and what right would look like. She did not hedge. She did not pitch. She spoke the way people speak when they are not trying to sell something, but are trying to identify whether a conversation is worth continuing. Sophia listened. She asked 3 questions. Each one was the question Harriet had been hoping someone would ask. By the end of the 20 minutes, they had not agreed to anything formal, but the shape of a collaboration had been drawn in the air between them. Present, agreed upon, needing only the paperwork. Harriet said, "I'll have someone contact you Monday." Sophia said, "I'll be expecting them." They shook hands. Harriet returned to the main terrace with the efficiency of someone who had come to this wedding for one reason and had accomplished it. Owen came back from the east wall. He said, without inflection, "How did that go?" Sophia looked across the terrace at the assembled guests, the hats, the morning suits, the children being managed toward the marquee for the reception, the sound of a band beginning to warm up somewhere inside. She said, "Well." He nodded. She picked up her glass. They walked toward the reception together, through a garden that was as perfect as a garden could be made to be, and she noticed, for the first time that afternoon, that the shoes she was wearing were not hurting her feet at all, which she decided to take as a reasonable sign. Inside the marquee, the seating at table 7 was filling in. The other guests at their table were a mix: 2 of Nikolai's friends from university, a woman who had been at school with Marguerite and who recognized Sophia without quite placing her, an older couple who were connected to the Ashford estate through the kind of long, complicated chain of friendship and obligation that English country families accumulate over generations. The woman who half recognized Sophia said, "I think we've met. Were you at Marguerite's birthday 3 years ago?" Sophia said, "No, I'm her stepsister." The woman said, "Oh," and then, because the truth was visible on her face before she could manage it, I didn't realize she had one. Sophia said, "We don't see each other often." She picked up the menu card from her place setting and looked at it with the attention it deserved. The canapés arrived. They were good, well-sourced, well-made, a little safe. She ate them and thought about what she would have done differently, and then stopped herself, because she was a guest, not a consultant, and this was someone else's day. Someone else's day. She looked down the room to the top table, where Marguerite sat with Nikolai and the immediate family. A tableau of everything the past 14 months had been aimed at producing. The dress, the flowers, the room, the name on the card that would now read Lady Ashford. Marguerite was talking to someone on her left. She was animated, composed, present. She was doing what she had always done best, performing the version of herself she had most carefully built, and she was doing it well. Sophia watched her for exactly as long as it took to understand what she was seeing. Then she turned back to Owen and the people at table 7 and began one of the better conversations of the evening, about architecture, about old buildings, about the particular pleasure of things that have been properly made and have lasted. It was a good conversation. It went on for a long time. The food came and was eaten, and the band played and people danced, and the evening went on being itself, and table 7 was louder and more alive than Marguerite had planned for it to be, though Marguerite was not watching it anymore by then. She had other things to watch. But the room had taken its own notes. The reply had sat on Marguerite's dressing table for 9 days. She had not thrown it away. She had not moved it. It occupied the edge of the table with the patient neutrality of something that has made its point and is willing to wait. The single card in its cream-colored envelope, Sophia's handwriting, small, neat, unhurried, visible through the slit she had already opened. "Thank you, Marguerite. I'll be there. Please expect 2. In all the momentum of the wedding preparations, the florist, the caterer, the seating revision, the conversation with Lady Helena about children and gardens and the obligations of estates, she had not stopped to think carefully about those 5 words. Please expect 2. She had heard them as compliance, as Sophia falling into the script with the only addition available to her, a +1 from wherever her life had taken her, dressed in whatever her circumstances could manage, making up the numbers in the row where the story needed her to stand. This was not arrogance on Marguerite's part, or not only arrogance. It was the product of a very specific kind of attention failure, the failure that comes from a model you have built being so complete and internally consistent that it stops accepting new information. She had a Sophia in her head, a Sophia she had known at 16, at 18, at the moment she left Hargrove House with a suitcase that wasn't full enough. That Sophia had been quiet, had been capable in a narrow way, had been, in the final analysis, going somewhere small. That model had served Marguerite well for over a decade because it had never been tested. Diana had not helped. Diana's plan had been elegant, in the way of plans built on incorrect premises. Invite her, yes. The contrast, yes. The toast, the gracious inclusion. All of it architecturally sound. None of it stress-tested against the question of what happened if the person you were contrasting yourself with had changed. Not changed, exactly. Grown. Which is a different thing. Change implies a departure from a previous state. What Sophia had done was more continuous than that. She had been growing the whole time, in the specific way that organisms grow when they are not impeded, when nothing is blocking the light, when the conditions are right and the discipline is there. She had been growing while Marguerite was not looking. The reception moved through its first hour in the way receptions do. The seating, the arrival of food, the initial noise of guests finding each other and discovering or rediscovering whatever connects them. The band played. The wine was poured. The room filled with the particular warmth of 120 people assembled in one place for a reason that everyone, at least publicly, agreed was a good one. At the top table, Marguerite was working. She was not unaware that this was the correct word for what she was doing. The meal was a performance in the technical sense. She had lines, she had positioning, she had a set of responses to the various situations that would arise because she had rehearsed them, not on paper but in her mind, over the 14 months that had built toward this afternoon. She knew what to say to Nikolai's mother. She knew what to say to his father, who was less warm and more observant, and needed handling of a different kind. She knew how to speak to the oldest Ashford cousin, who had a reputation for drinking more than was useful. and who needed to be kept both included and watched. She had thought of everything. She had not thought of the gift. Nikolai mentioned it to her at the end of the first course, leaning toward her with the slightly distracted look he had when something had genuinely caught his attention, rather than the alert attention he performed in public. He said, "Your stepsister brought something extraordinary." Marguerite said, "Oh?" He said, "A first edition of Hargrove's Survey of English Country Houses. Do you know it?" She didn't, but she understood, from his expression, that she should have. It was a book about houses like Fenmore Park, a survey of the great country houses, their histories, their architecture, their place in the English landscape. A first edition was the kind of thing you found in specialist dealers, and paid considerably for, and knew to look for, only if you already understood the territory. She said, "Where did she find it?" He said, "I have no idea." He was smiling in the private way he reserved for things that had genuinely moved him. He said, "She must have known about the restoration project." Marguerite had known about the restoration project. She had known about it for 2 years. She had known it was Nikolai's central preoccupation, the thing he talked about most, the thing that mattered to him most concretely. She had planned a gift that addressed this, a framed architectural print for the library, chosen with Diana's help, beautiful and appropriate, and somewhat generic in the way that beautiful and appropriate things sometimes are. The first edition was none of those things. It was specific. It was the gift of someone who had understood the person and bought accordingly. She said, "How thoughtful of her." And she meant it, almost, except that meaning it required a rearrangement of her understanding of the situation, and she was not in a position to do that rearrangement at the top table of her own wedding reception, so she filed it for later and returned her attention to the room. Lady Helena, Nikolai's mother, was talking to a woman near the edge of the room. Marguerite tracked the conversation with the peripheral attention she had developed for exactly this kind of monitoring. Not eavesdropping, just awareness. Lady Helena was animated in a way she was not always animated at social events, which meant the conversation was interesting to her, which meant the person she was talking to had said something of substance. The person was Harriet. This was expected. Harriet was Lady Helena's oldest friend, the person she had known the longest, and the person whose opinion she valued most. They had been talking all afternoon. This was normal. Marguerite returned her attention to the plate in front of her. Then Lady Helena said something that pulled the conversation toward the window, and the light fell differently, and Marguerite saw that there was now a third person in the exchange. Sophia. Not standing at the edge, not on the periphery. Standing inside the conversation with the easy body language of someone who has been included rather than added. Leaning slightly in, responding to something Harriet had said. Her hands quiet, her face attentive. Lady Helena laughed. She did not laugh often. Marguerite watched this for 3 seconds and then looked away. Diana was 2 seats down on the same side of the top table. Marguerite did not look at her. She did not want to see Diana's expression, because Diana's expression would reflect back the calculation they had both made, and the way that calculation was currently performing, and Marguerite was not ready for that reflection. She picked up her glass. She drank. She smiled at something Nikolai said. She was very good at this. What she was less good at, what she had never needed to be good at, was being wrong. Not wrong in a small way, the kind of wrong that is easily corrected and quickly forgotten. Wrong in the way of having built an entire plan on a premise that was false. She was beginning to understand that this was the shape of her afternoon. The second course was served. She ate it. She spoke to Nikolai's father, who was asking about the estate renovation timeline, and she answered competently, because she had made sure to be competent on this subject. She spoke to the bridesmaid on her right, who had a story about the ceremony flowers that was funny, and that Marguerite laughed at with real warmth, because it was genuinely funny, and because she still had the capacity for genuine laughter, even inside all of this. She was not a villain. That was the complicated truth at the center of the day. She had invited Sophia as a setup. She had done it with the particular logic of someone who had spent long enough in rooms where social positioning mattered, that it had started to feel like strategy rather than unkindness. But she was not a villain. She was someone who had been taught a specific way of measuring herself, and who had built her sense of safety around being on the right side of that measurement. Sophia was supposed to be on the other side of it. She was not on the other side of it. She was, by every visible measure of the afternoon, Exactly where Marguerite had always been. In rooms like this, with people like these, in a dress that needed no explanation, not matching Marguerite, not competing, just present, in the complete way. And that completeness was the thing that was hardest to absorb, because it left Marguerite without the contrast she had planned to use, and without the script that depended on that contrast. And a wedding day is not the moment when you want to discover that the script you have been carrying doesn't match the performance happening around you. She set down her glass. The band had shifted to something slower. A few couples were moving toward the dance floor. Children who had been sitting obediently since the ceremony were beginning to come loose and move through the room with the increasing energy of small creatures who have been asked to wait long enough. Diana appeared at her shoulder. She had left her seat on the pretext of something and was now standing close enough to speak quietly. "She looks different," Diana said. Marguerite said, "Yes." Diana said, "It's fine. The toast is still the toast." Marguerite said nothing. Diana said, "It's your day." She said it firmly, in the tone of a reminder rather than a reassurance. Marguerite said, "I know." She did know. And in the knowing was the awareness that knowing something and feeling it are not always the same thing, and that what she was currently feeling was the specific discomfort of a plan that had exceeded the boundaries of its own design. She would give the toast. She had written it. She had practiced it. It would be delivered and received, and the day would continue to be what it was supposed to be. But the version of the toast she had written, the version that included the gracious reference to her stepsister, the magnanimous inclusion, the gentle contrast, that version had assumed a Sophia who was standing in a different position in this room. And the Sophia, who was currently standing 3 meters away from Lady Helena, laughing at something, with the ease of someone who had never been outside this kind of room in her life, was not that Sophia. Marguerite looked at her table card. Her name, in the careful calligraphy they had hired someone to do. Lady Ashford. It would be by the end of the evening. She straightened it slightly, though it did not need straightening. She would give the toast. The afternoon, and everything in it, would resolve. She was certain of this. Almost certain. The morning had started in Marguerite's world. She had occupied it entirely. The hotel suite where the bridal party had assembled at 7. The cars that had arrived in sequence. The way every vendor and coordinator had moved according to her schedule and her preferences. The way Fenmore Park had been transformed over the previous week into an expression of her vision. The flowers, the linens, the placement of every chair. She had approved each element individually and revised several of them twice, and what she had produced was a day that was technically extraordinary and visually consistent and exactly as she had intended. And it had been hers until the cars started arriving and the guests came through the gate and the morning light fell across the courtyard and became something that belonged to everyone equally, regardless of planning. She had stood at the upstairs window at 9 o'clock, while Hannah was in the corridor managing a call about the cake delivery, and watched the first guests arrive. She watched how they walked into her day, how they looked at the grounds, how they responded to the setting she had built. She was counting the responses the way a director counts the audience's reaction during a performance, tracking whether the effect was landing. It was landing. They were moved, impressed, charmed. The oaks along the drive, the stone facade catching the morning light, the discreet perfection of the courtyard, all of it was working exactly as she had imagined. She had felt, at that moment, the specific satisfaction of a plan that had been executed correctly. Then the green dress had appeared in the courtyard. She had not been watching for it. She had not been thinking about Sophia in that moment. Her mind had been on the sequence of the morning, the timeline, the position of the sun in relation to the ceremony entrance, and whether the photographer she had hired understood the importance of the backlit moment at the door. She had been looking at the courtyard with a professional eye, tracking the overall composition of her day. And then the green dress. She noticed it the way you notice a piece of music that is not what you expected. Not wrong, not unwelcome, but requiring an adjustment of attention. The dress moved with the particular ease of something well made by someone who knew what they were doing, and the person inside it moved with the same ease, which was either very expensive or entirely natural, and which was, from this distance, indistinguishable from either. She had not recognized Sophia immediately. That was the first problem. The person she expected to see was so fixed in her mind that when the actual person appeared, there was a momentary failure of identification, a gap between the model and the reality. She had expected someone she would recognize instantly, and position instantly, and understand instantly, the way you understand a fact you have always known. The gap lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then it resolved, and she understood who she was looking at. And what she understood shifted something in the morning that she did not have time to examine, and therefore filed. She had gone back to her preparations. Now, at the point in the reception where the main courses had been cleared, and the staff were moving through the room with coffee, and the speeches were 20 minutes away, she was sitting at the top table, and the filing was beginning to come undone. It was the gift. The gift had done it. Nikolai had not stopped talking about the book. He had mentioned it to his father at the table, and his father had looked at it. It had been brought to the top table on Nikolai's request, which was a sign of how much it had affected him, because he was not a person who habitually made requests that drew attention, and had held it with the careful hands of someone who understood what he was holding. His father had said, "Where did your wife's sister find this?" Not stepsister. Sister. Nikolai had said, "I have no idea. I'll have to ask her." His father had said, "You should," and had looked down at the book again, with an expression that Marguerite had never seen on his face before, which was an expression of genuine, unguarded interest. His father was not an easy man. He had spent the past 2 years assessing Marguerite with the quiet thoroughness of someone evaluating a long-term investment, and had given no clear indication of his conclusions. This was the man who had said, at dinner 6 months ago, that he found most people in modern life to be oriented toward appearance rather than substance, and who had let the comment sit in the air of his dining room, while everyone at the table decided what to do with it. He had said it looking at no one in particular. He was not looking at the book with an eye for appearance. He was looking at it with the interest of someone who had found something real. Marguerite was a strategist. She took information in, and processed it, and produced assessments. The assessment she was producing now was uncomfortable, in the specific way that assessments are uncomfortable, when the conclusion they are reaching is one that serves no immediate purpose, but cannot be ignored. Sophia had understood what mattered to Nikolai, and through Nikolai, to his father, and through his father, to the family into which Marguerite had married. She had understood it with a precision that Marguerite, who had spent 2 years studying Nikolai and his world, had not quite matched. The print in the library was beautiful. The first edition was correct. There is a difference. She was still processing this when the evening's program moved forward and the toasts began. The best man spoke first. He was one of Nikolai's university friends, good-natured, unprepared in the way of people who believe charm can substitute for structure, but redeemed by genuine affection for Nikolai that came through clearly and made people smile. The room was warm. The speeches were going well. Then Lady Helena stood. This had not been in the program. Marguerite registered this with a fraction of her attention. The program had not included remarks from Lady Helena, who had said at the planning meeting 3 months ago that she preferred to let the younger generation lead on such occasions. She was standing now, champagne glass in hand, and the room settled quickly because Lady Helena was the kind of presence that rooms settle for, without needing to be asked. She said, "I am going to depart from the usual order of things for 1 moment." She looked across the room toward table 7. She said, "Sophia, would you say something?" The room turned. Sophia looked up from a conversation she had been having with Owen and the older couple at their table. She did not look surprised. She looked, briefly, at Owen, who gave her the small nod of someone who already knows the answer and is simply confirming she does too. She stood. She was calm, not the performed calm of someone managing nerves, but the actual calm of someone for whom public speaking is a professional function. She had addressed kitchen teams in 3 languages. She had presented in boardrooms. She had given feedback to owners of properties who did not want to hear it, and had delivered that feedback without flinching. She held her glass, and she spoke without notes. She said, "I have known Marguerite for 15 years. She paused. That is not quite the right way to say it. I have been in the same world as Marguerite for 15 years. Knowing someone is different. Knowing requires time of a specific kind. The kind where you are present to each other, not just in the same building." She looked at the top table, not at Marguerite, at Nikolai. She said, "What I can say about Marguerite is that she does not do things by half. She never has. She decides what she wants, and she works toward it, with a consistency that most people only manage for a week, before they lose energy. That is, she said, and now there was the edge of something in her voice that was not quite humor, and not quite something else, but was entirely controlled. Not always comfortable to be around. But it is real, and real is what lasts. She looked then at Nikolai's father, who was watching her with the expression he had given the book. She said, "Nikolai, you have married someone who will not forget anything, and will not stop. I mean that entirely as a compliment." She raised her glass. "To the family," she said. The room set it back. Table 7 was the loudest section. Marguerite raised her glass and drank. The toast she had written, the toast with the gracious inclusion, the strategic warmth, the reference to her stepsister who she was so generous as to invite, remained on the card in her jacket pocket, unread. The program had moved past the moment, and the room had moved with it, and the card stayed where it was. Diana did not look at her. Nikolai leaned over. He said, "She's quite remarkable." Marguerite said, "Yes." She meant it. That was the thing she had not anticipated, that at some point in this afternoon she would move from resistance to recognition. The recognition was not comfortable. It did not resolve into warmth, not yet, perhaps not for a long time, but it was there, as honest and inconvenient as most true things. She said, "She always was," and she picked up her glass and looked at the room she had built and drank the rest of her champagne, and the band picked up again, and the evening moved forward, and the day continued being what it was. Beautiful, expensive, precisely executed, and no longer entirely hers. Outside, the oaks along the driveway were beginning to go gold in the late light. Inside, at table 7, Sophia was laughing at something Owen had said. The older couple they had been talking to all evening were laughing too. The sound was natural and loud, and did not mind who heard it. It was, on the whole, a very good evening. The dancing started at 8:30, and the marquee changed. It changed in the way that enclosed spaces change when the formality of a meal lifts and people are given permission to move. The careful seating arrangements became suggestions and then dissolved entirely, and the room sorted itself into new configurations based on actual social gravity, rather than table plans. People who had been sitting near each other for 3 hours without speaking suddenly found themselves in conversation at the edge of the dance floor. Old friends who had been separated by the seating logic of the top table and the wedding party came together in the middle of the room and talked with the urgency of people making up for a few hours of necessary distance. Table 7 migrated. The older couple, Jeffrey and Francis, had drifted toward the far side of the marquee, where a small group was forming around 2 of Nikolai's country friends, who had stories to tell about the estate and the surrounding land. Owen had gone in that direction too, because Jeffrey had mentioned something about the stone wall restoration on the east side of the property, and Owen had asked a question about it, and Jeffrey had said, "Come and I'll show you what I mean," and the 2 of them had moved toward the nearest window, together with the focused body language of people who have found their topic. Sophia was at the bar, not in the way of someone who needed a drink, but in the way of someone who had found a useful place to be in a room that is reorganizing itself. The bar was a natural observation point. It gave you something to do with your hands and a reason to be stationary while everyone else was in motion. She was watching the room, not with any particular agenda. She had given up, at some point in the previous few hours, the low-level vigilance she had maintained all day, the awareness of Marguerite's position, of the toast that had been planned, of the script that had been prepared around her. That vigilance had dissolved somewhere between the toast Lady Helena had prompted and the moment Harriet had shaken her hand and said Monday. After that, the day had simply been a day, a very beautiful day in a very beautiful place, with food that was good but not quite as good as she would have made it, and music that was pleasant, and people who were, for the most part, interesting when you spoke to them. She had a glass of water. A man appeared beside her, mid-30s, dark jacket, the relaxed bearing of someone who had been here many times and was comfortable in this house, in the way of extended family. He said, "You gave the best speech of the day." She said, "I'm not sure I gave a speech. I said 4 sentences." He said, "Best 4 sentences of the day, then." He held out his hand. "My name is Charles. Nikolai is my first cousin." He said it with the slight apology of someone who knows the family connection is the least interesting thing about him. She shook it. Sophia, I'm Marguerite's stepsister. He said, yes, I know. She looked at him. He said, Harriet told me. She doesn't usually recommend people she's only just met. She recommended you while you were still talking to her. He paused. She's my godmother. I grew up being taken seriously by her, which means I take her assessments seriously. Sophia said, what did she recommend? He said, you specifically, not your work, though she mentioned that. You. She said, that one knows exactly what she has, and doesn't feel the need to explain it to anyone. Sophia was quiet for a moment. She said, that's a kind thing to say. He said, she's not kind, she's accurate. That's actually more useful. He turned to watch the dance floor, where Nikolai and Marguerite were having the kind of first dance that had been choreographed at some point in the planning, and which they were executing with competence, if not quite joy. She's been looking for someone to partner with on the Eastern European project for a long time, he said. You should know she's serious. When Harriet decides something, it tends to happen. Sophia said, I got that impression. He said, good. He looked at her sideways. Your stepsister didn't know what she was doing when she invited you, did she? It was not exactly a question. Sophia said, I don't think she did any harm. She gave me a reason to be here. The rest of it was just the day. He said, that's a generous reading. She said, it's an accurate one. He considered this. Then he said, would you and your friend like to see the house properly? There are parts they don't show guests. Nikolai's offered before, and I've always taken him up on it. He said this in the tone of someone who has found the best version of every room he has ever been in, and makes a habit of it. She said, yes. She found Owen at the edge of the crowd near Jeffrey, who was still going. She touched Owen's arm. He looked at her, then at Charles. She said, we're going to see the house. Owen said to Jeffrey, I'm sorry to interrupt. He shook Jeffrey's hand. He said, this has been the best conversation I've had in months. Jeffrey said, and meant it, likewise. He pressed a card into Owen's hand. Come and see the wall in daylight. There is something I want to get a second opinion on. Owen said he would, and meant it. And then he was beside Sophia, and the three of them moved out of the marquee, and into the house. The house was different at night. In the morning light, it had been impressive in the objective way of very old things that have been properly maintained. At night, with the party sound reduced to something distant, and the interior lit only by wall lamps, and the occasional floor light that had been placed for navigation rather than atmosphere, it was something else. It was the version of itself that it had been for the 2 centuries before anyone started hiring it for events. Inhabited, specific, carrying the particular density of a place that has absorbed a great deal of living. Charles walked them through the formal rooms first, a library that contained, among everything else, a space on a lower shelf where the first edition would eventually live, its spine facing out, and Sophia noticed the space with the particular attention of someone who had measured the gap correctly. Then a long gallery with portraits going back several generations, each face slightly more composed than the last as you walked backward in time, as if the earlier generations had not yet learned to perform themselves for paint. Then a room that was not shown to guests. It was a smaller room off the back corridor, not especially grand by the standards of the house, but furnished with the accumulated intimacy of a place where a family had actually lived rather than performed living. A worn sofa, a lamp with a crooked shade, books stacked horizontally, because there was not quite enough vertical shelf space, and the solution had been the obvious one, rather than the elegant one. A dog basket in the corner, empty but clearly still in use, with a knitted blanket folded inside it. Charles said, this is the room where Nikolai's grandmother used to read. She died 3 years ago. Nobody's changed anything. Owen sat down on the sofa without being asked. The way you sit when a room has that quality. Sophia stood at the bookshelf and looked at the books. They were arranged in no particular order. Novels beside farming manuals, beside a field guide to British birds, beside several decades of an estate management journal, with handwritten notes in the margins, different handwriting for each generation. She pulled one of the estate journals out, looked at the margin notes. 2 lines of handwriting had a small argument going, one in faded brown ink, one in darker blue. She put it back carefully. She said, it's the realest room in the house. Charles said, yes. He was leaning in the doorway. He said, Nikolai spent a lot of his childhood in here. He said it in the tone of something that explains other things without needing to elaborate. Owen said, from the sofa, "The good rooms always look like nobody tried." Charles laughed, surprised, genuine. He said, "That is exactly right." They stayed in that room for 40 minutes. The party noise from the marquee reached them as something distant and pleasant, like a sound from another life, and they talked about buildings and food, and the particular difficulty of preserving things while letting them be used rather than treated as museum pieces, which is the challenge of every old house and every old recipe and, Sophia thought but didn't say, every old family that hasn't figured out the difference between history and living. When they went back to the marquee, it was past 10. The younger guests were dancing in earnest. The older ones were at the edges, talking with the focused warmth of people who have given themselves permission to be fully present. The flowers on the tables had opened more in the warmth of the room, and the whole marquee smelled of them now, something sweet and just slightly too much, the way flowers always are when there are enough of them. Marguerite was on the dance floor. She was dancing with Nikolai, and they were not in the choreography anymore. They were just dancing, which was different, and which suited him better than the formal version had. He looked happy. He looked, in fact, genuinely happy, and Sophia thought, well, that is what matters, isn't it? Marguerite saw her come back in. Their eyes met across the dance floor in the specific way that eyes meet across crowds, not by design, not avoided, just the way it happens. Marguerite's expression was not readable from that distance. It was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of someone who is inside, a moment that has turned out to be larger than they planned for, and who has not yet decided what to do with the extra space. Sophia held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, without expression, and moved toward Owen. It was not a performance. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not exactly. It was the specific acknowledgement that passes between people who share a history and have arrived, each from their own direction, at the same evening, still distinct, still themselves, still carrying the shape of the years between them, but for this one night, in the same room, under the same flowers, listening to the same music. That was as far as it went. It was enough for the evening. Owen appeared with 2 glasses of something cold, and they stood near the edge of the dance floor and watched the room move. And it was, in the quiet way that the best evenings are, very good. Monday came in the ordinary way that consequential Mondays do, quietly, on schedule, with no fanfare. Sophia was at her desk by 8. She had been up since 5:30, which was her habit, and had done the early morning the way she always did. Coffee, the walk to the market 2 streets over, where the bread vendor saved her a sourdough loaf she had been ordering for 14 months. The 40 minutes in her kitchen, where she developed recipes. The hour of actual work email, before the day officially started. By the time the call came at 9:15, she had already done several hours of what she considered real work, and was in the functional state that comes from being occupied before anyone has asked anything of you. The call was from a man named Patrick, who introduced himself as the administrative director of the Hartley Cultural Foundation, and who spoke in the precise, information-dense way of someone who has managed institutional relationships for long enough to know that people's time is the most expensive thing you are asking for when you make a phone call. He said, "Lady Harriet asked me to reach out. She said to tell you she meant what she said on Saturday." Sophia said, "I understood that she did." He said, "She would like to propose a meeting with you and your hotel group to discuss the partnership framework she has in mind. She is available Wednesday or Thursday of next week in London." Sophia said, "Thursday works." She looked at her calendar. "Can you do 2 o'clock?" He said, "I'll confirm by end of day." They ended the call in 3 minutes. Sophia put her phone down on the desk and looked at the wall above it for a moment. Not at anything specific, just at the wall, in the brief way that marks a point of recognition before you move on. She moved on. She emailed Claire. The email was short. It said, "I met someone at the wedding on Saturday. Her name is Harriet, and she runs the Hartley Cultural Foundation. I'll send you more detail, but I think this is the partnership you've been looking for, the Eastern European properties. I'm meeting her Thursday. Can we speak before?" Claire replied within 4 minutes, which was not unusual for Claire. She said, "I know who Harriet is." "How did you meet her?" she said. "Also yes. Call me Tuesday evening." Sophia said, "She was there." Claire said. At the wedding? Sophia said. Yes. Claire took a moment that was probably her sitting back in her chair and doing something with her expression that Sophia could not see but could accurately imagine. Then she said, "Tell me everything on Tuesday." Sophia closed her email and went back to the recipe she had been developing that morning, which was a version of a braised dish she had been working on for the Budapest autumn menu. The problem she had been having with it for 3 weeks was a question of timing. At what point did you add the element that should not be overcooked? And how did you manage that timing in a service environment where you could not watch every individual portion? She worked on this problem for 45 minutes and arrived at a solution that she wrote down in the notebook she kept beside the stove. And the solution worked because it moved the problem from the moment of service to the moment of prep, which was the right place to solve it. She made a note to send the revision to the Budapest kitchen team. It was 10:15. The morning was already full. She thought briefly, as she washed her hands at the kitchen sink, about Saturday. Not with any particular feeling. Not triumph, not warmth, not the residue of the old ache that had sometimes come with thoughts of Hargrove House in the early years. Just the neutral accounting of it. She had gone. She had been in a room where she was not expected to be at ease, and she had been at ease, not because she had performed it, but because she actually was. She had met Harriet. She had given 4 sentences that had been the most honest thing said at the top table all day. She had walked through a room that was built around someone else's idea of contrast, and had simply been herself, which was apparently enough. Owen had come on Thursday as usual, and they had talked about the weekend, among other things, and he had mentioned that Jeffrey had called on Tuesday to follow up on the wall. She had said, "Are you going to go?" He said, "Next month. Do you want to come?" She had said, "Yes." That had been the extent of that conversation, because they were both people who did not over-explain decisions that were already clear, and it was clear. Now, on Monday morning, the week was proceeding with its ordinary demands, and she was meeting them in her ordinary way, and the weekend was already becoming what all weekends eventually become, part of the past, feeding the present in ways that would not always be traceable. The Thursday meeting with Harriet was in a building in Mayfair that had the particular quality of institutions which have been doing important work for a long time without making noise about it. The reception was quiet, the art on the walls was good, the receptionist was efficient without being cold. Harriet came down herself to meet Sophia, which was a detail that mattered to the kind of attention Sophia paid, because the people who come down themselves are usually the people who have decided they already know the value of what they are about to discuss. They sat in a meeting room, with a long table and good light, and no catering beyond water, which was also a detail. Harriet was not putting on a show. She was having a meeting. She put a folder on the table. She said, "I'll give you the overview, and then I want to hear your questions." In Sophia's experience, the quality of what you heard could be measured almost exactly by the quality of the questions it produced, and she'd found this metric more reliable than most. The overview took 20 minutes. The foundation had been funding cultural and hospitality projects in Eastern Europe for 11 years. They had 40 active partners in 8 countries. The gap they had identified was a specific one. There were excellent culinary and hospitality traditions in the region that were being inadequately represented in the international hospitality market, not because they were unknown, but because the people working within them did not have the institutional infrastructure to make them visible without compromising what made them worth knowing. What they needed was a bridge, not a consultant who would come in, extract information, and translate it for an outside audience. A partner who lived inside both worlds simultaneously. Sophia listened. She asked 6 questions. Harriet answered 4 of them directly. On the 5th, she said, "That's the right question, and I don't have the answer yet." On the 6th, she said, "That's the question I was hoping you'd ask, because it's the one that determines whether we can actually do this." They talked for 2 hours. Claire joined by phone for the last 40 minutes, and she and Harriet had a conversation that was efficient and substantive in the way of people who respect each other's time and have no interest in performing anything. By the time Sophia left the building, it was raining, the gentle ongoing English rain that makes no promises and keeps no schedule. She stood under the awning for a moment and looked at the street. The shape of what was coming was not yet fully defined. It would take months to develop. The framework agreement, the pilot, the slow process of building something that was worth building. It was not a moment, it was a beginning, which is less dramatic than a moment, but more durable. She thought about the Saturday morning in her kitchen, 3 months ago now, when the cream envelope had arrived through the mail slot, and she had set it on the counter and gone back to the pastries because the oven timer had gone off. She thought about Marguerite writing those 4 words at the bottom in her looser handwriting. "Do bring someone, darling." She thought, yes, I did. She pulled her coat tighter and walked out into the rain, and within 2 blocks she was thinking about the Budapest menu again, because she had been awake since 5:30 and had several hours of real work left in her, and the problem of the braised dish was only half solved. The rain kept its gentle, non-committal pace. The city moved around her with its indifference and its opportunity and its absolute refusal to notice who was walking through it. She walked through it anyway. The magazine profile came 18 months after the wedding. It was not a large magazine. It covered food and hospitality in the specific way of publications that take their subjects seriously and assume their readers do too. Long features, careful photography, the kind of editorial voice that does not oversimplify. The journalist had spent 3 days with Sophia across 2 cities, watching her work, eating things she cooked and things she did not cook but had created the conditions for, talking to the people she worked with. The profile was 5,000 words. It was the kind of piece that gets saved rather than skimmed. The journalist had asked, near the end of their final conversation, about how Sophia had built the program from scratch, what the starting conditions had been, what the first year had looked like. Sophia had talked for 20 minutes about Tomislav in Zagreb, and Marta in Bratislava, and the kitchen renovation in Budapest, and the months of early mornings, and the specific pleasure of watching a team of people produce work that they were proud of, which was always the mark that something was working. The journalist had listened, and then said, "And what about before that? What put you on this path?" Sophia had said, "I got a scholarship at 16. I sat an exam and I came first. Everything after that was a consequence." The journalist had said, "What made you sit the exam?" Sophia had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was in a house where I needed to understand what I was capable of. There was no one in the house who was going to tell me, so I decided to find out for myself." The journalist had not pushed. She had let that sit and moved on to another question, and the version of it that appeared in the profile was shorter and cleaner, and said, "She describes her entrance into the culinary world as a quiet act of self-knowledge in difficult circumstances." Sophia had read that sentence twice and found it accurate. The profile did not mention Marguerite. There was no reason to mention Marguerite. She was not part of the story in any way that the story required telling, and Sophia was not the kind of person who explained herself by positioning herself against someone else. The response to the profile was what responses to good profiles usually are: sustained and specific. People who mattered in the industry read it and reached out. 2 other foundations expressed interest in the work she was doing with Harriet's organization. A chef she had admired for years sent a brief, warm note. Owen cut it out of the print edition and taped it to the inside of a cabinet in his workshop, which was the kind of thing he did quietly, and she found months later, and said nothing about, because it was exactly the right kind of thing, and she did not need to say anything. The foundation partnership had been running for 14 months by then, and what it was producing was the kind of thing that is difficult to quantify but unmistakable when you see it. Properties that had cultural depth as well as comfort. Food programs that were rooted in the place rather than imported to it. Local producers who had access to markets they had not previously been able to reach. Young chefs in Zagreb and Bratislava and Budapest who had a structure around them that the previous generation had not had. The work was not complete. It would not be complete for years. That was how she had always understood it, not as a project with a finish line but as a practice, something you kept doing because doing it was the right direction. Her mother had read the profile online and called her on a Sunday, which was when they always spoke. She said, "I'm so proud of you." She said it in the careful way of mothers who have always been proud but have not always had the words in the right order, and the care of it was more moving than eloquence would have been. Sophia said, "I know, Mum." Her mother said, "You were always going to be all right. I knew that. Even when things were—" She paused. "Even in that house, I knew you were going to be all right." Sophia said, "You told me I would be. Before the wedding, you said be careful, and I said I'll be fine." Her mother said, You said it like you meant it. I did mean it, Sophia said. Her mother said, yes. She said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has always understood the person they are talking to more fully than she was ever given credit for. And then she said, did you ever speak to Marguerite? After? Sophia said, she sent a note. Her mother said, what kind of note? Sophia said, a short one. It said that she had been thinking, and that she hoped Sophia was well, and that she realized the wedding had not gone quite the way she had planned. That was all it said. It was, Sophia said, as close to an acknowledgement as she expected to get, and she had received it as such. Her mother said, did you reply? Sophia said, I sent a card. Congratulations on the first year, something simple. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then she said, that was the right thing to do. Sophia said, it was the honest thing to do. I don't wish her harm. I never did. I just needed her to be further away than she was when I was 16. Her mother said, and now? Sophia said, now she is where she is, and I am where I am. There is enough distance. It's fine. There was a pause. Her mother said, is Owen there? Sophia said, in the other room. Her mother said, good. She said it with a satisfaction that was not complicated, just true. Then she said, are you happy? Sophia held the phone and looked out her kitchen window. The morning light was good. There were pastries in the oven, because she had made them, not for the bakery, but for herself, and Owen, because it was Sunday, and they had been awake early, and the habit was the habit. The city was quiet. The file on her desk held drafts of the autumn menu for 3 properties. The notebook beside the stove had 3 pages of notes in her handwriting. The cabinet in the other room had a page from a magazine taped inside it. She said, yes. She meant it, the way she meant things. Plainly, accurately, without needing it to be more than it was. Her mother said, good. She said it again, good. And then she moved on to the other things they talked about on Sundays. Her garden, a book she was reading, a story about a neighbor that was mildly funny in the way of small-town life, and the call went on in the ordinary direction that good things go in, forward and unhurried, full of the small details that are actually the large things. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway toward the end of the call. He had that Sunday morning quality, slightly undone, slightly unhurried, the suit and the careful shirt of Saturday long gone. He held up the coffee pot with a look that was a question. Sophia nodded. She held up 2 fingers. He got 2 mugs. She said goodbye to her mother. She put the phone down. She turned the oven down slightly, because the pastries were nearly done, and she had learned over years exactly the sound the oven made when it had gone a degree or 2 past where she wanted it. Owen set both mugs on the table and sat down. The pastries came out 2 minutes later. Good, the way things are good when the person making them has spent years getting better and has stopped needing to announce it to anyone. She set them on the table between the 2 mugs and sat down across from him. He said, your mum? She said, yes. He said, how is she? She said, she's well. She asked if we were happy. He picked up his mug. He looked at her with the steady look of someone who is where he means to be. He said, what did you say? She said, yes. He said, good answer. She broke open a pastry. The steam came up from it, clean and warm. Outside, the city was doing its Sunday thing, slower than Monday, louder than silence, full of its ordinary life. She ate the pastry and drank her coffee, and was exactly where she was, which had always been the whole point. The last thing Sophia said about it was in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. This is how the last word on most things arrives. Not at the end of a dedicated conversation. Not in the final paragraph of a letter composed for the purpose, but sideways, while you are talking about other things, and the subject surfaces naturally, because it is finished processing and is ready to be set down. She was in Budapest. It was 2 years after the wedding, 3 years after the first time she had walked into the kitchen in Zagreb and spent 2 weeks watching before she touched anything. The restaurant at the Budapest property had been reviewed again, a longer piece this time, in a publication that reached a wider audience, and the piece had been generous and specific, and had named Marta's influence on the pastry program and Tomislav's dish, now a fixture on the menu across all 3 Central European properties, and had said, in its final paragraph, that the food felt like it had grown from the ground it was served on, which was the highest thing you could say, and which Sophia had read standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee, and had set down without ceremony, because it was accurate, and accuracy is not a thing you need to celebrate, only to continue earning. The conversation in question was with a young woman named Lena, who had just joined the Budapest kitchen team as a junior cook, and who had that particular quality Sophia recognized because she had had it herself at a similar age: a watchfulness, an absorption, a tendency to listen more than she spoke, and to be learning in the listening. Lena was 22. She had come from a small city in the east of the country, from a family that did not have money but had a grandmother who cooked. Sophia had taken her on because of the grandmother, not literally. Because of what the grandmother had produced in her, a person who understood that food was not performance, that it was connection, and connection required knowing the people on both sides of the table, which required caring, which required the particular vulnerability of actually investing in what you were making, rather than just executing it. They were in the kitchen at the end of a lunch service, both of them cleaning down their sections. The rest of the team had moved into the transition between lunch and dinner prep, that middle hour when the kitchen has a different quality, slower, slightly looser, the pressure of service replaced by the more spacious work of preparation. Lena had been asking about the foundation partnership. She had heard Sophia reference it in a meeting the previous week and had done some reading, and now had questions. Good questions, the kind that showed she had read carefully and thought about what she had read before asking. Sophia answered them one by one. The structure of the partnership, the properties involved, the network of local producers they were building, the young chefs they were trying to support through the training and mentorship element. Then Lena said, "How did it start? The partnership?" Sophia said, "I met the right person." Lena said, "Where?" Sophia was quiet for a moment. She was wiping down the pass, the long stainless steel surface that runs along the front of the kitchen, where the finished plates are assembled before service. She did it with the automatic efficiency of someone who has cleaned 1,000 surfaces and keeps her hands occupied while her mind moves at its own pace. She said, "At my stepsister's wedding." Lena looked at her. She said, "She introduced you?" Sophia said, "She invited me." She said it without emphasis, simply as fact. "She invited me to the wedding." Lena said, "That was kind of her." Sophia turned to look at her for a moment. Lena met her eyes with the direct attention of someone who had said what she meant and was not hedging it. Sophia said, "Yes, it was. She meant it." That was the thing that had become clear. Over the 2 years since the cream envelope with the expensive paper had come through her mail slot at 5 in the morning while she was making pastries, it had become clear not in a flash, not in a single moment of resolution, but gradually, the way most clarity arrives, through the accumulation of days and the distance they create from the thing you are trying to understand. Marguerite had invited her as a joke. She had invited her as a setup, a piece of strategic staging in the production of a perfect day. She had done it to establish contrast, to confirm a hierarchy, to use Sophia as a prop in a story about herself. But she had invited her, and the invitation was a door. And Sophia had walked through it correctly, which was not a talent she had been born with, but a skill she had been building since she was 13 years old, with a suitcase that wasn't full enough, learning to be exactly herself, in rooms that were not arranged for her, learning to walk through doors that were opened for the wrong reasons, and to find what was worth finding on the other side. She would not call it a debt, she would not call it gratitude exactly, but she would, and did, call it accurate. It was accurate to say that Marguerite had given her something, even if the giving had not been the intention. She finished wiping the pass. She folded the cloth and set it in its place. Lena was still watching her with that careful attention. Sophia said, "The person I met there changed the direction of the work." She paused. "I would not have met her without the invitation." She thought for a moment. "I would not have been in that room without the invitation." Lena said, "So it worked out?" Sophia said, "It worked out the way things work out when you go through the door." She picked up the cloth again and moved to the next section. "You always have to go through the door, whatever the reason it was opened." Lena absorbed this. She went back to her own section. She was the kind of person who heard things and let them settle before she did anything with them, and Sophia had noticed this about her, the same way she had noticed everything else, without making a performance of the noticing, just accurately, because accuracy had always been her instrument. The kitchen moved through its preparations. The late afternoon light came in at an angle through the high windows, the way it did at this time of year, falling on the surfaces in strips that made the stainless steel look almost warm. Outside, the city was doing what the city did. The river was there, the bridges were there, the stones of the old streets were there, all of it carrying the weight of the years it had been there and not thinking about it. Sophia worked through the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen she had rebuilt and was still building, in the city she had not grown up in, and had made something of anyway, in the direction of the work that had not waited for anyone to tell her it was hers to do. She called her mother on Sunday. She came home to Owen on Thursday. She went to the market on Tuesday mornings and on Saturday mornings, and the bread vendor always had the sourdough ready, because she had been ordering it for long enough that it was simply the arrangement. She was 30 years old. She had been making herself, since she was 13, with the materials available and the light that was there, not waiting for better materials or better light, not explaining herself to rooms that had not yet understood the question, not needing anyone to open the right door for the right reason, just walking through. Just walking through, whatever was on the other side. That was all it had ever been. That was all it needed to be. The kitchen smelled of bread and stock and the faint metallic edge of clean steel. Lena was humming something low and half-conscious while she prepped her section. The sounds of a Budapest afternoon came through the high windows, irregular and full of the city's own business. Sophia put her hands in the water and kept working. She was, as she had always been, exactly where she was. And that, in the end, was everything.